value intimacy. And for some of you, you may put a great deal of value on giving of yourself. But what happens in the post-nut that you discover that for him, intimacy or sex, or another way of putting it, a nut, is just a nut, is just a nut, is just a nut. Welcome to the Dr. G.O. White Show, where we explore the vital role of Black fathers in strengthening families and building strong communities. I'm Dr. Gary O. White, your host, and today we're going to talk about a very interesting topic. Imagine, if you will, that you've entered into a relationship with a young lady. Y'all have met, let's say, 2-3 days, and within a week, y'all had sex. And it was the best sex you've ever had in your life. And then the relationship comes to an end. And then you get that call that she's expecting. Now you've come back to that relationship, and now you're trying to make something of it. You all have moved in together, and everything seems to be going well. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you discover that things are not the way you thought. But you've celebrated and shared with your boys how quick you were able to have sex with that woman. You got another notch onto your belt. But then you discover that all hell is broken loose. This is what I call a pre-nut, post-nut epiphany. So what is an epiphany? I'm sure you've heard that term in school or when you were studying or trying to understand something or make some sense of something in a job, and then all of a sudden it hits you. Aha, I got it. It is a sudden realization of that which was not clear, but suddenly becomes clear. Now add the concept of an epiphany to what I refer to as a post-nut or a pre-nut epiphany. So now what does that mean? That means that after you've slept with her, after you've slept with him, you've learned that something is different. And so there's so much oftentimes you can discover in the pre-nut that you don't realize until the post-nut. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about what you really need to learn in the pre-nut. You know, that moment before you all sleep, or that moment before you move in with each other, or, you know, that moment before you decide to have a child. That's the pre-nut. But the epiphany comes with the work of getting to know that person. There was a situation in which there was a father who started a wonderful relationship with a woman. Within 3 weeks, he had slept with her more than 5 or 6 times. They moved in together within less than 30 days. Everything appeared to be going well. And then she discovered that he doesn't handle conflict very well. He discovered that when she gets upset, she goes from 0 to 10 at an unprecedented level. These are the things in the pre-nut, before the investment of time and intimacy, that you need to know. So let's take a look at the difference between a pre-nut and what some of you don't discover into the post-nut. For example, your behaviors. You really need to know how they handle conflict, and these are things that you can discover in the pre-nut. That means you all have disagreements, and whether or not that person is willing or able to accept that they're wrong, or how they handle critiques or criticism. These are some things during the relationship building phase that you need to know. But the learning or discovering the fact that they can't handle conflict or they have a really bad temper, that's nothing that you need to discover in the post-nut. And the same thing with regard to family values or values in general. What happens if you now have a child with that person? You two have moved in and you discover that what they value around relationships is completely different from you. In the post-nut, you discover that they don't believe in monogamous relationships, but in the pre-nut, you just thought that that's what you all were doing. And so it is in that pre-nut phase that I emphasize that you get to know that person. You value intimacy. And for some of you, you may put a great deal of value on giving of yourself. But what happens in the post-nut that you discover that for him, intimacy or sex, or another way of putting it, a nut, is just a nut, is just a nut, it's just a nut. You need to understand if a nut is just a nut, and not in the post nut, but in the pre nut. But then there are some things that I'm going to emphasize that we really need to come to understand early in the relationship. Mental health. Mental health. Discovering that someone has a rich history of schizophrenia or a diagnosis dealing with their anger or their emotional dysregulation. These are some things you need to know before you give of yourself, again, before you move in with one another. And so we focus on mental health in the pre-nut, in the relating phase that I'm going to emphasize is critical. You don't need to discover in the post-nut that is an issue for someone. Now, not to say that someone with a mental health issue that you need to run for the hills. I'm simply saying that in the pre-nut, in those early phases of the relationship, before you give of yourself, these are some things that you really need to know. But from a strengths perspective as well, a strong or healthy mental health or mental status is very important as well, especially you know yourself that you may find yourself struggling with emotional management. So the pre-nut piece becomes absolutely critical. But the pre-nut also is important when it comes to understanding their family values. Imagine, if you will, you're dating someone and they tell you that they have no relationship with their mother or they are cut off from their family members, but yet they're telling you how much they love or how close they are to individuals. You need to know in the pre-nut and understand their family values. This is nothing that you need to discover in the post-nut. So I want you to invest your time in the pre, to understand how they get along with their families, to understand their family dynamics, their family history. These are some things, and of course I'm talking about when you are considering having a more serious relationship with someone. Now remember, when I say a serious relationship, seriousness does not always equate to intimacy. So we want to focus on how important it is for you to understand their family values or their mental health issues as early as possible. And you learn that not by what they say in the pre-nut, but what you see in their interaction with family members. You also need to understand in the pre-nut and not the post-nut their value around friends. I don't tell people to run, but I will say that it's a red flag when you enter a relationship with someone that has no close friends. There's no best friend that they can talk about. When you're getting to know that person in the pre-nut and you're coming to understand, but yet they're saying, I'm a loner. I'm not saying run from it, but there's certain things you don't want to discover in the post-nut that you should have known in the pre-nut. They have no relationship with friends because they burnt all the bridges. And so this is something that's critical that we focus on in the pre-nut. But even more serious, learning about a history of family violence. Yes, he's the most more romantic human being you know. He buys you flowers. He cooks you food. He takes you out to dinner. He buys you beautiful things. You are overwhelmed because in the pre-nut, you're getting things and having experiences that you've never had before. But then you discover in the post-nut that he has a history of violence. You discover in the post-nut that the last 3 to 5 relationships that he was in ended in family violence. There's some things in the pre-nut, by talking with family and talking with friends, that you discover these differences or these challenges. It is through the pre-nut phase that you have the conversation. I'm always telling people to focus on getting to know that person and how they ended their last relationships. This is the pre-nut process that I put a great deal of emphasis on. And of course, we focus on spirituality. You know, there's nothing more frightening that you go to church, you engage in spirituality, you love to pray, and your family values those things, and you believe that when you have a child, you're going to make sure that they're spiritually grounded, but you didn't know, or you discovered in the post-nut, that the person you with has very little value about their beliefs or their spirituality or their practice. But now you two have a child together. But now you two have moved in together. Now you're realizing in the post-nut that some things that you would have done differently. And the truth is, when you talk to many people who've terminated relationships, or when you talk to people who've been divorced 2 or 3 times, they're going to tell you things that they wish they would have known, or things that they wish they would have seen early. You don't meet a representative, you meet the actual person in that phase of the relationship. And so I'm going to encourage everyone who are watching this show to focus on the pre-nut, to be intentional about developing an understanding about all the aspects and the dynamics of that person. Now, when you do that, here's what I believe. You're going to reflect back on what I've said, and it's going to hit you that everything that Dr. White has emphasized and the focus that I'm telling you to give towards the pre-nut, when you do, there's a new epiphany that will be born. And that is the epiphany that realizing that what I've shared with you have prevented you from entering an unhealthy relationship. And in that moment, you'll reflect and say to Dr. White, I'll toast to that.